Hey YouTube! So what programming language should you learn first? My short answer would be pick either Python or JavaScript. And throughout this video, I'm going to explain why I picked those two particular languages, and I'm going to walk you through the process for picking the right first language for yourself for your particular situation and preferences. So as you pick the first language for yourself, one thing to keep in mind is that once you know one language, whether it's C++, Java, or anything else, as long as you know one, it's going to be much easier to learn any additional languages because all programming languages are sort of related and similar. So I would say if you already started learning one language and if you like what you're learning, just keep going with that. Other than that, there are 3 points you should consider as you pick the right first language for yourself. Number 1, the job market. Actually, the job market is a tricky point to consider because it highly depends on your location and the industry you want to get into. So for example, if you want to get into a startup in San Francisco, good languages to learn might be JavaScript, Go, or Python. And if you're interested in going into gaming or banking, a better option might be C# or C++. So I would say just take a look at the job postings of the kinds of jobs you're interested in on websites like LinkedIn and Indeed.com and just look at what their requirements are. Now, the second point to consider is what you want to build. And I'm just going to give you a quick list here. If you want to build iOS apps, so whether iPhone apps or iPad apps, I would go with Swift. And if you want to build Android apps, I would go with Java first and then maybe Kotlin after that. If you want to build websites, I would get started with JavaScript, HTML, and CSS first. And if you're into data analysis, engineering, science, or machine learning, I would get started with Python, R, or MATLAB. And if you want to do game development, I would go with C# or C++. So as you can see, there are a lot of different options here depending on what you want to build. And the third point to consider is the ease of learning. Like I said in one of my previous videos, I would say Python is easier to learn than C++ or C, and JavaScript is easier to learn than Java. So what programming language should you learn first? Well, it highly depends on your particular situation, but I would say in general, try to find something that fulfills all of these 3 criteria. So ideally, find something that's in demand in the job market, lets you build something you want to build, and is relatively easy to learn. And that actually brings us to Python and JavaScript. And that's because they're both relatively easy to learn, and they both tend to be in demand in the job market as well. So which one of these programming languages should you learn first? That actually depends on what you want to build. So if you're more interested in the logic side of things than visuals, then I would say go with Python. Python is often used to build server-side code or backend code of websites, which is basically the code that runs on your servers. Many companies also use Python for data analysis, data science, and machine learning purposes. For example, when I was working at Google, I used Python to visualize and analyze some data there. So if you're interested in building websites instead, I would first go with JavaScript. And if you go with JavaScript, first learn HTML and CSS. So the way it works is HTML and CSS determine what your web pages look like, and JavaScript allows you to add functionality to those web pages. For example, you can add a piece of functionality that says, when I click this button right here, it's going to change the color of this other button right there. And you can see all of that, HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, as a set of code that runs on your device or on your browser. And that's called front-end code. And that alone, the front-end code alone, is actually not enough to make a complete website. For example, something like Facebook. Because when you go to facebook.com, Facebook needs to know who your friends are, and that information is not stored on your device or on your browser. It's stored somewhere on Facebook's server. So you need code that runs on Facebook's server or your own website's server, and that's called backend code, which I mentioned earlier, as opposed to front-end code. And to make backend code, developers use something else. For example, Node.js, which is based on JavaScript, or Django or Flask, which are something called web frameworks that are based on Python. So actually, to make a complete website, you need to learn a lot of things. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, as well as at least one web framework. But I would say just start with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript if you're interested in building a website. Okay, if you're interested in learning Python, I'd recommend my Python tutorials for absolute beginners right there. And if you want to see my top 5 language recommendation, you can see my video about that right there. And if you're new here, and if you're not part of the CS Dojo community yet, you should join us by subscribing to this channel. I'm YK from CS Dojo, and I'll see you guys in the next video.